Chapter 2. The Bible as Metaphor. Ever since Benedict Spinoza and Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, in other words, since the beginning of modern philosophy, there has been a continuing debate about the Bible author's identity. Knowing their identity would place them in specific eras and would shed light on the diverse motives that would have driven this magnificent text. From the traditional assumption that Moses, inspired by God, wrote the Pentateuch, through the Bible criticism of the 19th century that dissected the text and assigned the sections to different times and places, to current interpretations that attribute the greater part of the work to the Persian or even the Hellenistic period, there have been numerous and conflicting hypotheses. But while there has been considerable progress in the field, resulting directly from the achievements of philology and archaeology, it is doubtful that we shall ever know with certainty when the Bible was written and who its authors were. The position of the Israeli pioneers of the Tel Aviv school, Nadav Naiman, Israel Finkelstein, Zev Herzog and others, who argue that the historical core of the Bible was composed in the reign of Josiah, toward the end of the kingdom of Judah, offers attractive conclusions, but much of its interpretation and reasoning is less than solid. Their analyses, showing that the Bible could not have been written before the end of the 8th century BCE and that most of the stories it contains lack all factual substance, are fairly persuasive. But their basic assumption, that the invented past was an obvious product of a manipulative ruler, Josiah, inadvertently leads to a problematic anachronism. For example, The Bible Unearthed, a rich and stimulating book by Israel Finkelstein and Neil Asher Silberman, depicts a fairly modern national society whose sovereign, the King of Judah, seeks to unify his people and the refugees, from the defeated kingdom of Israel by inventing the Torah. The desire to annex the territory of the northern kingdom prompts the writing of a rallying history in order to unite the two parts of the new nation. Yet these two able archaeologists, and others who follow in their footsteps, have no extra-biblical evidence about a monotheistic cult reform in Josiah's little kingdom in the 7th century BCE. They are content to rely on this text as long as there are no findings to contradict it, and they load it repeatedly with elements typical of political modernity. On encountering their work, the reader is likely to imagine that although the inhabitants of Judah and the refugees from Israel did not have television or wireless sets in every rural hut, they could at least read and write, and eagerly circulated the newly printed Torahs. In an illiterate peasant society without an educational system, or a standard common language, and with limited means of communication, only a few % could read and write. A copy or two of the Torah might have been a fetish but could not have served as an ideological campfire. Similarly, a sovereign's dependence on his subjects' goodwill is also a modern phenomenon, which archaeologists and Bible scholars, with little historical awareness, keep grafting onto ancient history. Kings did not need to rally the masses around a national politics. They generally contented themselves with a loose ideological dynastic consensus among the administrative class and a narrow stratum of landed aristocracy. They did not need the commitment of the people, nor did they have the means of yoking its consciousness, such as it was, to their monarchy. Explaining the origin of the first monotheism in the context of widespread propaganda conducted by a small, marginal kingdom seeking to annex the land to the north is a very unconvincing historiographic argument. However, it might be indicative of an anti-annexationist mood in early 21st century Israel. It is a strange theory that the bureaucratic and centralistic needs of the government of Little Jerusalem before its fall gave birth to the monotheistic cult of YHWH alone and the composition of a retrospective theological work in the form of the historical parts of the Bible. Surely Josiah's contemporaries, reading the narratives describing Solomon's mighty palaces, would have expected to witness remnants of past grandeur in their city streets. But since those vast ancient palaces had never existed, as archaeology has shown, how could they have been described prior to their imaginary destruction? It is more probable that the ancient kingdoms of Israel and Judah left detailed administrative chronicles and vainglorious victory inscriptions, composed by obedient court scribes, such as the biblical Shaphan, son of Azaliah, as was the case in other kingdoms in the region. We don't know, and never will know, what those chronicles contained, but in all probability some were preserved in the surviving archives of the kingdoms, and after the fall of the kingdom of Judah the authors of the books of the Bible used them, with amazing creativity, as raw material from which to compose the most influential texts in the birth of monotheism in the Near East. To these chronicles they added some parables, legends and myths that circulated among the intellectual elites throughout the region, producing a fascinating critical discourse about the status of the earthly ruler from the viewpoint of a divine sovereign. The upheaval of the exile and return in the 6th century BC could have allowed the literate Judean elite, former court scribes, priests and their offspring, greater autonomy than they might have enjoyed under a direct dynastic monarchy. A historical contingency of political breakdown, and the resulting absence of an exigent authority gave them a new and exceptional opportunity for action. Thus was born a new field of unique literary creativity whose great reward lay not in power but in religion. Only such a situation could explain, for example, how it was possible both to sing the praises of the dynastic founder, David, and at the same time depict him as a sinner punished by a superior divine being. Only thus could the freedom of expression, so rare in pre-modern societies, produce a theological masterpiece. We may therefore propose the following hypothesis: the exclusive monotheism that stands out on almost every page in the Bible was the result not of politics, the politics of a minor local king seeking to expand his realm, but of culture, the remarkable encounter between Judean intellectual elites, in exile or returning from exile, with the abstract Persian religions. This monotheism probably found its source in an advanced intellectual system but was extruded from it and, like many revolutionary ideologies throughout history, seeped into the margins under political pressure from the conservative center. It is no accident that the Hebrew word dat, religion, is of Persian origin. This early monotheism would become fully developed in its late encounter with Hellenistic polytheism. The theory of the Copenhagen-Sheffield School, Thomas L. Thompson, Niels Peter Lemke, Philip Davis and others, is more convincing, even if we do not adopt every one of its assumptions and conclusions. It says, in effect, that the Bible is not a book but a grand library that was written, revised and adapted in the course of 3 centuries, from the late 6th to the early 2nd BCE. It should be read as a multi-layered literary construction of a religious and philosophical nature, or as theological parables that sometimes employ quasi-historical descriptions for educational purposes, aimed especially at future generations, as the system of divine punishment often punishes the descendants for their forebears' transgressions. The various ancient authors and editors sought to create a coherent religious community, and drew lavishly on the glorious politics of the past to prepare a stable, durable future for a cult center in Jerusalem. Concerned to isolate it from the idolatrous population, they invented the category of Israel as a sacred, chosen people whose origins lay elsewhere, in contrast to Canaan, a local anti-people of hewers of wood and drawers of water. This text group's appropriation of the name Israel was perhaps due to its rivalry with the Samaritans, who saw themselves as heirs to the kingdom of Israel. This self-isolating literary politics, which began to develop between the little province of Yahud and the centers of high culture in Babylonia, accorded well with the global identity policies of the Persian Empire, whose rulers took pains to separate communities, classes and linguistic groups in order to retain control over their vast possessions. Some of the leaders, judges, heroes, kings, priests and prophets, mainly the later ones, who populate the Bible may have been historical figures. But their time, their relationships, their motives, their real power, the boundaries of their rule, their influence and manner of worship, that is to say, what really matters in history, were the product of a later imagination. Likewise, the intellectual and religious consumers of the biblical story cycles, namely, the early Jewish faith communities, took shape much later. Knowing that Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar tells us little about ancient Rome, but a good deal about England in the late 16th century does not detract from its power and helps us to view its historical testimony in a different light. Sergei Eisenstein's film The Battleship Potemkin, which is set during the Revolution of 1905, tells us little about that uprising but much about the ideology of the Bolshevik regime in 1925, when the film was made. Our attitude to the Bible should be the same. It is not a narrative that can instruct us about the time it describes but is instead an impressive didactic theological discourse, as well as a possible testimony about the time it was composed. It would have been a more reliable historical document if we knew with greater certainty when each of its parts was written. For many centuries the Bible has been regarded by the three monotheistic cultures, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, as a divinely inspired work, evidence of God's manifestation and preeminence. With the rise of nationalism in modern times, it began to be seen increasingly as a work composed by human beings as a reconstruction of their past. Even in pre-nationalistic Protestant England, and even more so among the Puritan settlers in North America and South Africa, the book became, through anachronism and fervent imagination, a kind of ideal model for the formation of a modern religious political collectivity. In the past, Jewish believers tended not to delve into it. But with the rise of the Jewish Enlightenment, growing numbers of cultivated individuals began to read the Bible in a secular light. Yet, as this chapter has tried to show, it was only the appearance of prenationalist Jewish historiography in the latter half of the 19th century that gave the Bible a leading role in the drama of the rise of the modern Jewish nation. The book was transferred from the shelf of theological tracts to the history section, and adherents of Jewish nationalism began to read it as if it were reliable testimony to processes and events. Indeed, it was elevated to the status of mythistory, representing an incontrovertible truth. It became the locus of secular sanctity that was not to be touched, and from which all consideration of people and nation must begin. Above all, the Bible became an ethnic marker, indicating a common origin for people of very different backgrounds and secular cultures, yet all still hated for their religion, which they barely observed. That was the meaning that underlay this image of an ancient nation, dating back almost to the creation, that came to be imprinted in the minds of people who felt themselves dislocated in the rough and tumble of modernity. It became imprinted in their consciousness of the past. The welcoming bosom of the Bible, despite, or perhaps because of, its miraculous and legendary character, could provide a long, almost an eternal, sense of belonging, something that the fast-moving, freighted present could not give them. In this way, the Bible became a secular book that school children read to learn about their ancient forefathers, children who would later march proudly as soldiers fighting wars of colonization and independence.